December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Snow drifts cover the frozen earth like a shroud, muffling the movement of 250,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and 2,000 artillery pieces. Adolf Hitler had staked everything on one last desperate gamble: the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. For the Allies, it was a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. A surprise attack that ripped through thin American lines, plunging the Western Front into chaos. Entire divisions shattered, towns fell, and thousands of young soldiers were captured in the opening days. But what the Germans could not know was that hidden inside Allied artillery batteries was a weapon so secret, so advanced, that its very existence had been guarded more closely than the Manhattan Project. A device that would transform artillery from a blunt hammer into a scalpel of annihilation, the proximity fuse. This is the untold story of how radar-equipped shells, exploding not on impact but in midair above German formations, rewrote the mathematics of war, multiplying killing power by 50, inflicting as many as 20,000 casualties in a matter of weeks, and marking the moment when technology, not tactics, became the decisive factor in modern warfare. Historians remember the Battle of the Bulge as Hitler's last offensive. But within that struggle lies a second story, the debut of the proximity fuse. And its baptism of fire would come not by cautious testing, but through one colonel's bold decision to defy orders and unleash America's deadliest secret. Before the Ardennes was over, these shells would detonate above elite Waffen-SS battalions, rip through Panzer Grenadier companies, and shred German columns advancing through narrow snowbound roads. Eisenhower himself later admitted, if Germany had developed the proximity fuse first, D-Day might have been impossible. This is how the fuse that should never have been used in Europe became the weapon that saved Europe. Snow fell steadily across the Ardennes as the battle raged on. In the frozen town of Bastogne, surrounded and cut off by German forces, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne fought desperately to hold their ground. Supplies were scarce, ammunition was low, and the men were cold and exhausted. For days, German tanks and infantry hammered at the defenders, trying to crush the pocket before relief could arrive. Every road into Bastogne was blocked, every attempt to break out met with withering fire. The Americans inside the town knew they were living on borrowed time. Yet in the fields beyond Bastogne, something extraordinary was happening. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, dug into snowy clearings, had begun firing proximity-fused shells into the German lines. The effect was devastating. As German infantry advanced across open ground, believing they had finally encircled the enemy, the shells burst high above them, spraying jagged shards of steel downward like rain. Soldiers who thought they were safe behind ditches or hedgerows were cut down instantly. Units advancing in tight formation were shredded before they even reached American lines. What should have been a swift victory for the Wehrmacht turned into a nightmare of carnage. Witnesses recalled seeing entire companies vanish beneath the airbursts. A soldier would raise his head to shout orders and then disappear in a spray of shrapnel. Tanks advancing toward the town were suddenly exposed as their infantry support melted away under the relentless pounding. The German assault faltered, then broke. Survivors spoke later of the terror of shells that seemed to know exactly where they were hiding, of an invisible hand of destruction that made every position vulnerable. Bastogne held not only because of the courage of the 101st, but because American artillery, armed with its secret weapon, had turned the surrounding fields into killing grounds. For the men firing the guns, the impact was equally shocking. They had seen artillery work before. They knew the destruction of a direct hit or the chaos of a barrage. But this was different. They watched through binoculars as German waves dissolved before reaching their lines, as entire attacks collapsed in minutes. Some spoke of it later with awe, others with a kind of horror at the sheer efficiency of the slaughter. They knew they were witnessing the future of war, where technology magnified human killing power beyond imagination. Farther north, near Malmedy, elite SS units were also learning the same lesson. Battle-hardened troops who had fought in Russia and believed themselves invincible suddenly faced artillery that rendered their tactics useless. They could not dig in deep enough, could not disperse quickly enough, could not hide in the forest. The shells followed them wherever they went, detonating in the air, cutting through branches, spraying deadly fragments into foxholes. The discipline of the SS could not withstand the chaos. Their assaults lost cohesion, their morale crumbled, and for the first time they realized that sheer toughness and training could not overcome this new American weapon. The statistics told the story even more brutally. In the Ardennes, American artillery fired more than 200,000 proximity-fused rounds in just 3 weeks. Casualty reports suggested that as many as 20,000 German soldiers were killed or wounded by these shells alone. In some sectors, the effectiveness of artillery increased by 50-fold. Attacks that might once have overwhelmed defenders now collapsed before they even reached rifle range. The battlefield itself had changed, and with it the psychology of war. By Christmas of 1944, the Germans were bleeding out in the snow. Their great offensive, which had begun with such thunderous momentum, was stalling. Fuel shortages crippled their tanks, air power returned to the skies as the weather cleared, and everywhere their infantry paid a terrible price to American artillery. At Bastogne, General McAuliffe's famous "nuts" reply to a German surrender demand became a symbol of defiance. But behind that defiance stood the unseen hand of the proximity fuse, breaking every German attempt to crush the town. Patton's Third Army, racing north through the snow, found the way cleared by the devastation these shells had wrought. German positions that should have held out were already broken, their units shattered before contact. When Patton finally relieved Bastogne, he knew he had witnessed not just the courage of airborne troops, but the triumph of a weapon that multiplied their chances of survival many times over. And yet, the secret remained. Few soldiers firing the guns truly understood what made the shells so deadly. They simply knew they worked. Few officers dared to speak of them in letters or reports, for fear the secret would spread. To the Germans who survived, it was an inexplicable terror, a sudden shift in the balance of the battlefield they could not counter. To the Allies, it was proof that science, industry, and boldness had changed the rules of war forever. The forests along the Sauer River were quiet when dawn broke, a mist clinging to the ground, muffling sound. German troops, veterans of years of war, moved cautiously through the fog. They believed the Americans opposite them were exhausted and thinly spread, that the surprise of the Ardennes offensive still gave them momentum. What they could not see, hidden behind tree lines and camouflaged positions, were American artillery crews waiting for the order to fire. When the command came, the silence shattered. Dozens of guns roared at once, their shells arcing high into the sky before descending toward the German columns. But instead of burying themselves in the frozen earth as the Germans expected, the shells exploded in the air above them. The proximity fuses had been set to detonate 30 to 50 feet over the advancing formations. The result was a storm of steel that fell from the sky with devastating precision. General George S. Patton, never one to miss a battle, stood on the heights overlooking the river and watched. He later described it in grim detail. 700 German soldiers were cut down in a single engagement, their bodies littering the snow, their advance halted almost before it began. Entire companies were erased in minutes, stunned survivors stumbling away from the blasts, many too shocked to fire back. For Patton, who had studied war his entire life, it was a revelation. Artillery had always been deadly, but this was something altogether new, an efficiency of destruction he had never before witnessed. For the Germans on the receiving end, it was incomprehensible. Their officers had prepared them for American artillery fire, but not for this. No foxhole was deep enough, no tree thick enough to provide cover. The shells found them no matter where they hid. Soldiers who tried to dig into the snow were torn apart before their trenches were complete. Units that had advanced confidently under the cover of darkness found themselves annihilated in the pale morning light. Survivors spoke of the terror of airbursts, of the feeling that the very sky had turned against them. In the aftermath, Patton rode among the fallen, surveying the battlefield with cold calculation. He understood at once what this meant. If the Americans could mass-produce these fuses, if they could fire them in every engagement, then the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. German tactics of massed infantry attacks were obsolete in an instant. The battlefield had been transformed into a killing ground where technology decided life and death. Patton, who admired boldness above all else, recognized the genius of those who had built and deployed this weapon. He also understood its terrible cost to those who faced it. Word of the slaughter spread quickly among German survivors. Rumors circulated in the ranks that the Americans had developed a shell guided by some unseen magic, a weapon that could sense where they were hiding. Morale began to falter. If the enemy possessed such power, how could ordinary soldiers resist? The psychological impact was as destructive as the physical one. Troops hesitated to advance, fearful of invisible death from above. Some officers reported their men refusing to move in daylight, convinced they would be annihilated before firing a shot. For the Americans, the proximity fuse became a symbol of hope in the darkest winter of the war. Soldiers at the front spoke of it with reverence, calling it the miracle shell. They knew it had saved lives, that without it the German offensive might have broken through. In the hands of gunners along the Sauer, at Bastogne, and across the Ardennes, it turned retreat into resistance and despair into defiance. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. One shell with a proximity fuse was worth dozens of standard rounds. Attacks that once required hours of bombardment could be broken in minutes. In a war where logistics determined everything, where supply lines dictated victory or defeat, this efficiency meant the Americans could do more with less, conserving resources while maximizing destruction. As Patton departed the battlefield that day, he carried with him more than a victory. He carried proof that the future of war lay not only in bravery or numbers, but in innovation. He knew, as Eisenhower and others soon admitted, that if Germany had developed the proximity fuse first, the cost of the war might have been unimaginably higher. D-Day itself might have failed. The fate of Europe might have been entirely different. But in that frozen valley by the Sauer River, the outcome was decided in minutes. 700 German soldiers lay dead in the snow, testimony to a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen. And the Americans, battered but unbroken, were reminded that even in their darkest hour, they possessed a secret that could turn the tide of war. At Malmedy, the elite units of the Waffen-SS pushed forward with the determination expected of Hitler's chosen formations. Hardened by years of combat on the Eastern Front, these soldiers were accustomed to harsh conditions and brutal fighting. They advanced through the Ardennes confident in their superiority, believing that the Americans would falter under pressure. But what awaited them was unlike anything they had ever faced. As they approached American defensive lines, artillery opened up with a volume and precision that stunned even seasoned veterans. The SS had faced barges before, but these were different. Shells detonated above their heads rather than in front of them or on the ground. The proximity fuses transformed ordinary artillery into a rain of steel shards that no helmet or trench could resist. Whole squads were torn apart in seconds, their advance halted in a storm of invisible fire. The effect on morale was catastrophic. These were not ordinary troops. They were the best Germany could field, indoctrinated from youth, trained to believe in their invincibility. Yet within hours they found themselves scattered, broken, and retreating from positions they had expected to overrun. Survivors later described the sky as if it had turned into a weapon. Every step forward answered with explosions above their heads. Even the SS, whose reputation for fanatical discipline preceded them, wavered under this onslaught. At Bastogne, the story was the same, but on a grander scale. The town, surrounded by German forces, had become a symbol of American resistance. The men of the 101st Airborne and their supporting artillery units held out against relentless German attacks. Supplies were short, the winter bitter, and the enemy determined. Yet the defenders had a weapon the Germans could not match. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, using proximity-fused shells, became the backbone of Bastogne's defense. German infantry, massing for assaults across open ground or emerging from the cover of the woods, were cut down before they could reach the American lines. Each barrage exploded in the air, scattering lethal fragments across formations, leaving survivors stunned and demoralized. The defenders could fire fewer rounds while inflicting disproportionate casualties, conserving their precious ammunition while multiplying its effectiveness. When German officers demanded the Americans surrender Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with a single word, "Nuts." Behind that defiance stood not only the courage of paratroopers, but also the confidence that their artillery, armed with the new fuses, could hold back the enemy. And it did. The German assaults, which might have overwhelmed the garrison under normal circumstances, bled themselves white against a wall of airbursts that shattered every attempt to break through. The psychological toll grew heavier with each failed attack. German prisoners captured outside Bastogne admitted they had never experienced anything like it. Some believed the Americans had invented a weapon that could read their minds, that the shells somehow sought them out wherever they moved. Rumors spread quickly through the ranks that advancing meant certain death, not from visible tanks or machine guns, but from unseen forces in the sky. The battlefields of Malmedy and Bastogne became laboratories of modern warfare. For the first time, technology so completely overmatched human courage that even the most fanatical troops could not endure it. German commanders, desperate for progress, urged their men forward, but the results were always the same: shattered formations, mounting casualties, and dwindling morale. The effect rippled outward. Units that might once have fought on to the last man began to falter. Reports of massacres at the hands of artillery fire spread to other divisions, weakening their will before they even faced the Americans. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last gamble in the West, depended on momentum and shock. But proximity fuses denied both. Every attempt to mass forces for a breakthrough ended in carnage. And so the tide of the battle turned. What had begun as a bold strike intended to split Allied lines and force negotiations instead collapsed into a slow, grinding retreat. By early January 1945, it was clear even to the most loyal German commanders that the offensive was doomed. And at the heart of that failure lay a weapon so new, so secret, that many Americans in uniform did not yet know of its existence. The proximity fuse had been born out of desperation and vision years earlier, when Allied scientists realized that conventional fuses limited the effectiveness of artillery and anti-aircraft fire. A shell that struck the ground could devastate trenches, but it could not touch soldiers taking cover or aircraft soaring overhead unless it scored a direct hit. The need for a fuse that could sense its target and detonate at the precise moment had been discussed in laboratories long before the Ardennes, but the technological obstacles seemed insurmountable. Miniaturizing radar into a device small enough to fit inside a shell, yet strong enough to withstand the unimaginable stresses of being fired from a gun barrel, was considered nearly impossible. The shock of 20,000 times the force of gravity crushed ordinary components instantly. Vacuum tubes shattered, circuits failed, and prototypes burned out. Yet Allied scientists persisted. The breakthrough came when teams in Britain and America, working in guarded secrecy, designed ruggedized miniature vacuum tubes that could survive the violence of artillery fire. Every component was tested, retested, and redesigned to endure extremes no civilian radio or radar set would ever face. Each fuse was, in essence, a tiny radar station sealed inside a steel casing, sending out signals and listening for the echo. When a target, be it an aircraft or the ground below, reflected the signal strongly enough, the fuse triggered detonation at the perfect altitude. The project demanded an unprecedented mobilization of industry. More than 100 companies across the United States were quietly enlisted to produce parts undercover stories that concealed their true purpose. Workers who assembled tiny components on production lines were told only fragments of the truth, enough to perform their tasks, but never enough to grasp the whole picture. This secrecy was essential. If Germany had learned the details of the technology, it could have changed the course of the war. The cost was staggering. Nearly $1 billion was poured into the project, a sum greater than the entire cost of the Manhattan Project that produced the atomic bomb. But the results justified every dollar. By 1944, American factories were producing 40,000 proximity fuses a day, a flood of precision instruments unlike anything in military history. Pallets of these fuses rolled off production lines and were shipped in guarded convoys to the front lines. At first, the technology was reserved for anti-aircraft defense. The threat of German bombers over London and WWII flying bombs demanded a weapon that could intercept targets without the impossible demand of scoring direct hits. American gunners equipped with proximity-fused shells suddenly found themselves shooting down aircraft at rates previously unimaginable. The skies that once belonged to the Luftwaffe turned lethal. Squadrons of bombers that had terrorized cities now faced death from invisible bursts before they could reach their targets. Yet the true leap came when bold officers began experimenting with using the fuses in ground warfare. Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson, among others, saw the potential to unleash their full destructive power against infantry and vehicles. Official regulations at first forbade their use on the battlefield, fearing a dud shell might be recovered by the enemy and expose the secret. But in the chaos of combat, with American lines under threat, Axelson and others ignored the rules. They loaded the shells, fired them into advancing German troops, and witnessed something extraordinary. Instead of striking the earth, the shells detonated in the air, scattering lethal fragments across entire formations. Soldiers who might have survived by hugging the ground found no safety. Trenches became traps, open ground a killing zone, and woods a death trap. Word spread quickly among American commanders. Requests for proximity-fused shells multiplied, and shipments were rushed to the Ardennes front. By the height of the Battle of the Bulge, more than 200,000 of these shells had been fired, raining destruction with an effectiveness that stunned both allies and enemies. Eisenhower himself later remarked that if Germany had developed the weapon first, D-Day might have been impossible. This miracle of science, hidden behind layers of secrecy and produced at staggering cost, had now revealed its worth. In the frozen forests of Belgium, it did more than kill soldiers. It shattered the last hopes of a German victory in the West. General George S. Patton, never a man to spare words when describing the brutal realities of war, left one of the most vivid accounts of the proximity-fuse's battlefield impact. During the fighting near the Sauer River in late December 1944, Patton personally observed American artillery firing the new shells against German troops who were massing for an assault. What he witnessed was beyond even his seasoned expectations. As the German columns began to emerge from the cover of the trees and push toward American positions, batteries opened fire with proximity-fused rounds. Instead of exploding on impact with the frozen ground, the shells burst high above the advancing troops. Each detonation created a deadly halo of steel fragments that swept across the battlefield. Patton later recorded that in a matter of minutes, 702 German soldiers lay dead or wounded, entire formations cut to pieces before they could even reach striking distance. The efficiency was staggering. Where traditional artillery might have required hundreds of shells to inflict such damage, a fraction of that number armed with proximity fuses produced devastation on a scale that stunned everyone who saw it. To Patton, it was confirmation that technology had delivered the edge that courage and training alone could not. He was a commander who believed in the ferocity of attack, in the power of morale and momentum, but he understood that here was something different, a weapon that could break an enemy's will before the first rifle shot was fired. In his reports, he praised the new fuses as a decisive factor in halting the German advance and protecting his men from being overrun. The Germans themselves were bewildered. Survivors described the experience as fighting under a sky that had turned against them. They had prepared for artillery barges, dug into the hard earth of the Ardennes, and braced themselves for the concussions of shells striking the ground. But nothing prepared them for the invisible death raining from above. No amount of discipline, no tactic, could counter it. The instinct to take cover, honed by years of war, failed them, because cover no longer meant safety. The proximity fuses broke not just bodies but minds. German commanders reported difficulties in rallying their men for fresh assaults after such barrages. Soldiers who had once charged fearlessly into machine gun fire hesitated to mass together, knowing that even before they reached the enemy, the sky itself could erupt into a storm of shrapnel. At the Sauer, as elsewhere in the Bulge, this meant that German momentum faltered. What Hitler had intended as a swift, crushing blow against the Allies dissolved into piecemeal attacks, each broken apart by artillery before it could gather strength. The great gamble of the Ardennes was collapsing, and proximity fuses were one of the hidden reasons why. American artillery officers began to recognize just how revolutionary the technology was. Some wrote that they no longer needed to fire barrages in depth as before, blanketing wide swaths of terrain in hopes of hitting moving targets. Now, with far fewer shells, they could achieve greater destruction. Every round became exponentially more valuable, conserving precious ammunition stocks in a campaign where resupply was often uncertain due to the winter weather and damaged roads. For the infantrymen on the ground, the difference was life itself. Soldiers holding frozen foxholes and thin defensive lines knew that behind them stood artillery capable of annihilating entire German companies before they ever reached the wire. Morale surged as the new weapon proved itself again and again. What had seemed a desperate defensive fight slowly transformed into confidence that the line would hold, that the Germans could not break through no matter how ferociously they tried. And in the quiet moments after battle, when soldiers walked the fields littered with broken equipment and shattered units, they saw with their own eyes the scale of what the proximity fuses had done. It was not only victory, but survival, purchased by a technology so secret and so devastating that most would not even know its name until long after the war ended. At Bastogne, the surrounded town that became a symbol of American defiance, the proximity fuse proved its worth more dramatically than perhaps anywhere else during the Battle of the Bulge. The 101st Airborne Division, cut off by German forces and enduring one of the harshest winters in living memory, relied not only on their courage and stubbornness, but on the artillery that guarded their defensive perimeter. Among the units holding the line was the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. Armed with proximity-fused shells, they turned every German assault into a slaughter. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, desperate to capture the crossroads town before Patton's Third Army could relieve it, launched repeated attacks with infantry, armor, and artillery of their own. Each time, American gunners answered with airbursts that blanketed entire fields and roads in cascades of deadly fragments. For the Germans, it was a nightmare. Columns forming up in the snowy woods were torn apart before they could leave cover. Infantry advancing across the open fields around Bastogne were shredded by explosions above their heads, fragments slicing through ranks like invisible scythes. Tanks that attempted to break through found their supporting infantry annihilated before they reached American foxholes, leaving the armored spearheads exposed and vulnerable. The defenders of Bastogne, cut off from supply lines and rationing food and ammunition, suddenly had a weapon that multiplied their limited resources. Where a conventional shell might only crater the frozen ground or kill a few men in a trench, proximity-fused rounds could devastate entire platoons in a single blast. Every round fired became a force multiplier. This was crucial because the paratroopers had little to spare. Ammunition was precious, and each decision to fire had to be weighed against the risk of running dry before relief came. The proximity fuses made every decision more effective. Fewer shells did the work of hundreds, holding the town against overwhelming odds. German commanders around Bastogne grew frustrated and bewildered. Reports described how attacks that should have succeeded collapsed almost instantly under artillery fire that seemed supernatural in its accuracy and effectiveness. Prisoners later testified to their terror at advancing into what they called the wall of fire from the sky. Many admitted that they no longer believed the town could be taken, no matter how many men were thrown at it. Inside Bastogne, morale was shaped as much by the artillery as by the famous reply of General Anthony McAuliffe, "Nuts," to the German surrender demand. The men of the 101st knew they were surrounded, cold, hungry, and short on supplies. Yet when the ground shook with the thunder of their own guns, when they saw the effects of the airbursts on German assaults, they understood they had more than courage on their side. They had science and technology that gave them a decisive edge. The psychological effect went both ways. American paratroopers who might otherwise have been overwhelmed by fear of the encirclement drew strength from the knowledge that the Germans could not mass forces against them without suffering catastrophic losses. At the same time, German units tasked with storming the town lost faith in their mission with every failed attempt. Even the elite panzer units, accustomed to smashing through enemy lines, faltered when their supporting infantry melted away under the storm of proximity-fused shells. By the time Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve Bastogne in late December, the defenders had endured days of siege and relentless pressure. They were tired, frozen, and bloodied, but still holding the town. The proximity fuses had not only saved Bastogne, but preserved the symbol of American resistance that rallied the Allies during Hitler's last great gamble. The Ardennes offensive was already faltering elsewhere, but at Bastogne the battle revealed a deeper truth. Courage could hold a line, but technology could ensure that line was never broken. In the forests and fields around the town, amid shattered German formations and abandoned weapons, the future of warfare had revealed itself. The secrecy surrounding the proximity fuse was absolute, born from the fear that if Germany ever captured one intact, the balance of the war could shift dramatically. Allied high command knew how revolutionary the technology was. General Eisenhower himself later admitted that if the Germans had possessed proximity fuses during the Normandy landings, D-Day might have failed outright. The thought of their flak batteries filled with radar-triggered shells tearing through Allied planes and landing craft was a nightmare scenario. For this reason, strict orders governed their deployment. Early in the war, proximity fuses were authorized only for anti-aircraft defense over water. If a shell malfunctioned and fell intact, the sea would claim it, leaving nothing for German scientists to study. Using them over land, where dud rounds could be recovered, was forbidden. Commanders who disobeyed risked court-martial. But rules written in quiet offices often collided with reality on the battlefield. In late 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge raged, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson, an artillery commander faced with relentless German attacks, made the fateful decision to ignore the ban. His men were running short on conventional shells, and the pressure on their sector was increasing. The survival of his troops demanded something more. Axelson ordered proximity-fused rounds fired against ground targets. The results were immediate and devastating. German assaults that had seemed poised to break through were stopped in their tracks. Infantry advancing across snowfields were obliterated before reaching American lines, while those huddled in cover found no safety as explosions rained death from above. Axelson had gambled his career on a desperate choice, but in doing so, he unlocked the true potential of the weapon. Word spread quickly up the chain of command. Reports of entire German formations shattered by a fraction of the expected ammunition convinced higher officers to relax restrictions. Soon, more units across the Ardennes were issued proximity-fused shells for ground use. What had begun as one colonel's unauthorized act became official policy, and the results spoke for themselves. By the time the Ardennes offensive collapsed, over 200,000 proximity-fused shells had been fired. Analysts later estimated they caused between 15,000 and 20,000 German casualties, a staggering toll that rivaled the losses inflicted by entire divisions. The decision to deploy the fuses openly had not only saved American lives, but may have accelerated the collapse of Hitler's last great offensive in the West. The secrecy, however, remained intact. Every dud shell that landed was carefully guarded, recovered, or destroyed to prevent even the smallest chance of German capture. Soldiers who handled the fuses were reminded constantly of the importance of concealment. Only after the war would the full story emerge, as captured German officers admitted they had no idea such a weapon existed until it was too late. Axelson's gamble had changed history. His defiance of regulations, born out of necessity, revealed the weapon that turned the Ardennes forest into a death trap for German forces. The episode became a striking reminder that in modern warfare, rules often bend in the face of survival, and sometimes it is the bold choice of a single commander that alters the course of an entire battle. The industrial story behind the proximity fuse was as remarkable as its battlefield performance. To create such a weapon required nothing less than a miracle of mass production, coordination, and secrecy on a scale rivaling even the Manhattan Project. Unlike the atomic bomb, however, this project demanded not the work of a single laboratory, but the collective effort of more than 100 companies scattered across the United States. The challenge was staggering, a device the size of a clenched fist that had to act as a tiny radar system, emit signals, detect reflections, calculate distance, and trigger detonation, all while enduring the unimaginable stress of being fired from a cannon. A shell left the muzzle with forces up to 20,000 times the pull of gravity, crushing every component inside it. Ordinary vacuum tubes shattered instantly under such strain, yet the entire mechanism relied on their delicate filaments and glass envelopes. American engineers solved the problem by designing miniature vacuum tubes unlike anything seen before. Ruggedized and shock-resistant, these tiny marvels were hand-assembled with the precision of watchmakers, yet produced in industrial quantities. Factories trained thousands of workers, many of them women new to electronics, who learned to solder and assemble the delicate circuits by the thousands each day. The secrecy of the project was ironclad. Most workers were told little or nothing about what they were building. Some believed they were working on radio components. Others thought they were producing parts for aircraft instruments. Very few had any idea that the devices they built would change the course of battles thousands of miles away. Guards patrolled the factories, shipments moved under armed escort, and every precaution was taken to prevent leaks that might alert German intelligence. By 1944, the effort reached astonishing scale. American industry was turning out 40,000 proximity fuses every single day. Pallets stacked high with crates left assembly lines and traveled by truck and rail to ports, where they were shipped under the highest security to Europe and the Pacific. Over the course of the war, millions of these fuses were produced at a total cost of nearly $1 billion, a staggering sum at the time, greater even than the cost of the atomic bomb program up to that point. But while the Manhattan Project had one primary site in Los Alamos and a handful of supporting facilities, the proximity fuse effort was everywhere, diffused across the industrial landscape. Companies like Crosley, RCA, and Westinghouse each contributed vital parts, while smaller firms in towns across the country worked on components so specialized that they had no idea how their pieces fit into the whole. Only a few top scientists and military officials knew the entire picture. The logistical achievement was just as impressive as the technological one. Each fuse had to be rugged enough to sit in ammunition depots for months, yet sensitive enough to detect a target in fractions of a second. Each had to be tested, inspected, and packaged under conditions of extreme secrecy. And when they finally reached the battlefield, soldiers trusted them to work every time, under conditions of mud, cold, and chaos. In this way, America's factories became the unseen soldiers of the Battle of the Bulge. Every shift worked. Every soldered wire and sealed vacuum tube contributed directly to the survival of men in foxholes thousands of miles away. Without the industrial might that produced these devices in such staggering numbers, the weapon would have remained a laboratory curiosity. Instead, it became a war winner. By the end of the war, more than 22 million proximity fuses had been produced, a triumph of science and industry working hand in hand. The Germans never even came close to duplicating the technology. Their scientists experimented with radio-controlled detonators, but shortages of resources, Allied bombing, and a lack of coordination doomed their efforts. What America accomplished in secret workshops and sprawling assembly lines was beyond Germany's capacity in the final years of the war. The story of the proximity fuse was not just about a brilliant idea, but about the ability of a democracy to mobilize its people, industries, and resources for a common purpose. It was proof that war in the 20th century would not be won by soldiers alone, but by the factories, engineers, and anonymous workers who armed them with tools beyond anything the enemy had ever imagined. Proximity fuses did more than kill. They rewrote the rules of artillery warfare. Commanders who had spent careers perfecting barges, creeping fires, and counter-battery shoots suddenly found their doctrine upended. Where once mass shells aimed to crater terrain or smash fortifications, now each round could be tuned to produce an airburst that showered lethal fragments across the enemy at the precise height that maximized casualties. Trench lines and shallow foxholes lost their protection. Concealment under hedgerows, behind small ridges, or in stand-up formations became almost meaningless when shrapnel rained down from above. Gunnery officers recalculated everything. Tables of charges, fuse settings, and firing angles were reworked to exploit the new phenomenon. Mathematical models of lethal radius replaced older empirical rules. Optimal airburst heights were determined to maximize arc and fragment spread, with 30 to 50 feet above ground proving devastating against dismounted infantry and light vehicles. Concentration of fire changed from blanket saturation to targeted airburst barges that could slice across a column in its depth and breadth in seconds. Artillery became surgical rather than merely destructive. Logistics adapted as well. Planners who had rationed high-explosive rounds now factored in the relative efficiency of fuse-equipped shells. Fewer rounds, properly employed, could halt an assault that once demanded scores of conventional salvos. This mattered in the Ardennes, where roads were clogged with refugees, weather-delayed convoys, and winter gnawed at supply lines. A battery that could knock out an enemy company with a few well-placed salvos conserved precious tonnage of ammunition and fuel and reduced the need for risky resupply runs under enemy observation. Tactically, infantry commanders altered their formations. Where tight columns and massed assaults had once overwhelmed defensive lines by weight of numbers, dispersion and new movement techniques were hastily adopted to reduce vulnerability to airbursts. But dispersion brought its own costs. Scattered troops were harder to control, communications broke down more easily in the snow and under fire, and isolated squads became easy prey for local counterattacks once the initial airburst passed. The Germans found themselves trading one problem for another, either mass and risk being cut down en masse, or disperse and lose cohesion and combat power. At higher levels, doctrine shifted toward integrating artillery as a dominant defensive and offensive tool rather than a supporting arm. Corps and army commanders began to plan operations assuming that proximity-fused fire could blunt or shatter enemy formations before close engagement. Counterattacks were planned to exploit the disordered remains of units broken by airbursts, turning local tactical success into operational collapse. In the Ardennes, this meant that German attempts to concentrate forces for a breakthrough were repeatedly met with barges that turned momentum into disintegration. What had been a war of maneuver became, in these sectors, a war of attrition enforced by the sky itself. The psychological effect on German troops was as decisive as the physical one. Veteran officers reported that after a few encounters with airbursts, men stopped obeying orders to mass and advance as they had been trained. Indecision spread, and hesitation became contagious. Combat stress rose dramatically. Units lost the will to assault, not simply because of casualties, but because of the seemingly arbitrary and omnipresent nature of the threat. Fear, once an instrument to be managed, now undercut initiative. A formation that expected to supplant a defending line found itself frozen as men scanned treetops and hedgerows for invisible detonations. Lower-level initiative evaporated. Commanders could no longer rely on their troops to execute risky maneuvers under the anticipation of sudden overhead death. Commanders who embraced the new reality reaped rewards. Batteries with proximity fuses enjoyed higher mission effectiveness and fewer friendly casualties in defensive fights. Artillery observers learned to coordinate airbursts with small arms fire, creating overlapping kill zones that funneled enemy survivors into pre-planned kill pockets. Engineers rethought obstacles and fields of fire, integrating artillery patterns into blocking positions that made any attempted avenue of approach a gauntlet. In this way, the fuse amplified existing combined arms concepts. Infantry, armor, engineers, and artillery operated with a new logic where skybursts channeled enemy movement into prepared traps. The German response, constrained by material shortages and the impossibility of replicating the technology quickly, was limited. Doctrine that had relied on shock and speed was forced to adapt to a perpetual threat overhead. Night attacks and infiltration tactics increased, but proximity fuses could be devastating even in low visibility when massing troops were detected by advance fire. Efforts to counter by using denser camouflage or deeper shelters worked only marginally. The sheer density of fragments and the unpredictability of burst points made perfect concealment impractical in the field. From a strategic perspective, the fuse's impact reverberated beyond individual battles. Victory in the Ardennes preserved supply lines and political momentum for the Allies. It prevented German forces from recapturing vital ports or severing Allied armies, and it conserved Allied manpower for the final push into Germany. The fuse did not, by itself, win the war, but it changed the calculus of operations, shortening the timeline by denying the enemy the ability to regain initiative through massed, concentrated offensives. In that sense, the proximity fuse functioned as a force multiplier, its effects compounding across multiple engagements to produce outcomes disproportionate to the number of shells expended. Academic studies and after-action analyses in subsequent years quantified what frontline soldiers already knew in their bones. In sectors where proximity-fused fire was available and skillfully employed, the rate of enemy assault breakdown increased dramatically. Casualty ratios favored defenders to a degree unseen in previous campaigns. Commanders adjusted expectations for attack success rates and redesigned risk calculations for committing reserves. The artillery, once the king of battle for its ability to prepare and suppress, now reigned supreme for its capacity to annihilate on demand. This new reality also reshaped training and doctrine for future generations. Artillery schools incorporated the lessons of the Ardennes into curricula: fuse selection, burst altitude optimization, multi-battery coordination, and psychological preparation of both friendly and enemy forces. The concept of the airburst, detonating a munition above the target to maximize anti-personnel effect, became foundational for post-war munitions development. Advances in ballistic computation, fuse miniaturization, and coordinated fire control all traced intellectual lineage back to those cold weeks in the Ardennes when the sky itself had been weaponized. In the immediate term, soldiers in the line found solace in the knowledge that, when called upon, artillery could turn overwhelming odds into survivable fights. Men who had dug foxholes and prayed through long nights learned to trust the guns behind them not just for suppression, but for decisive protection. The proximity fuse shifted the moral of the war in the minds of many. Technology had moved to the point where survivability depended as much on industrial innovation as on personal valor. That realization reshaped how armies were built, how wars were planned, and how nations imagined their security in the atomic age to come. In the end, the Ardennes became a crucible where doctrine, industry, and invention collided. The proximity fuse did more than end one offensive. It heralded a new epoch in warfare. Artillery was no longer a blunt instrument, but a precise and terrifying weapon of control. Where tactics once sought to outmaneuver the enemy, commanders now had to account for the invisible geometry of airbursts that could render maneuver moot. The result was a battlefield that favored those who could think in three dimensions: terrain, time, and the lethal volume of air above it.